My name is Loren Kirby, and I am a senior DevOps engineer, DevOps coach, and Agile coach at Delta Airlines. I'm here today to present about mob programming. First of all, I want to give a disclaimer. This is not something that I or Delta Airlines created or came up with. This comes from a presentation that I attended at the Dojo Consortium in 2019 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The presenter was a man named Woody Zuhl, and I was so impressed by his presentation that I brought it back to Delta. We tried it out in our dojo and had great success with it and started using it in other areas of the company. And at this point, in our cloud center of expertise, this is how we work almost exclusively. So without any further delays, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. I know we're running a little bit behind on time. So first of all, you're probably wondering what mob programming is. Give me just a second here. I need to rearrange my screen so that I can see things better. So mob programming is a variation on pair programming. In mob programming, we have a driver and we have several navigators, and the driver can be thought of as an intelligent input device as opposed to a keyboard or mouse, which is a dumb input device. The role of the driver is to take what the navigators describe and enter it into the computer. And the role of the navigators is to analyze the problem at hand and give the driver instructions on what to input into the computer. At predetermined intervals, in our case, usually 15 or 20 minutes, the driver becomes the navigator and one of the navigators takes over as driver. We usually do this in a round robin, although sometimes we allow some of the navigators not to drive. To quote our leading expert, in this case, Woody Zuhl, mob programming is all the brilliant minds working together on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, at the same computer. In order for an idea or a thought to pass from one person's mind into the computer, it has to first pass through another person's hands. Mob programming is not one person coding while a bunch of other people watch. That's not what we're trying to do here. And I first learned about mob programming, as I said, at the Dojo Consortium, which is an annual conference of companies that have internal dojos. And I was so impressed with the idea that I was eager to try it. You know, one of the things that happened at that session is that I walked up to the presenter, Woody Zuhl, after the session, and I asked him, I said, you know, what happens to your Agile ceremonies when you're doing mob programming? And, you know, I said, I didn't hear you talk about your Agile ceremonies. And he said, well, so what additional ceremonies would you need for us to do? We start the day, we pull an item from our backlog, we groom that item, we work on that story. At the end of the day, we review that story with the stakeholders and we move it to done. What other Agile ceremonies are needed? And it was as though someone had just hit me in the forehead. It was just this aha moment for me of, oh, this way of working gets rid of a lot of the wasted time that we sometimes impose with our Agile ceremonies. And, you know, taking it back to the Delta Dojo, we had a situation where in one of our classes, only about 10% of the learners were completing the lab work. We tried mobbing on the lab in small groups of 4 to 5 participants, and we went from 10% of the participants completing to over 90% of the participants completing. And since that went well, we tried it in another class and in another class with the same results. And anyone on the call who has ever facilitated any adult learning knows that to get 90% participation on the lab work is an excellent result. So we were very impressed by that. So we gather all the people together who need to work on a particular problem. We get people with all the different skills and knowledge. It's completely different people working together. We've got, in some cases, a business analyst, a product owner, the Scrum Master or squad leader, and all the technical people. in a room working together at the same computer on trying to solve the same problem. And the main concept is this driver navigator system where, for an idea to go from someone's head into the computer, it has to pass through someone else's hands. It's not 5 people watching one person code. It looks like this. This is an actual photograph from our Delta Airlines dojo. It also looks like this. And here are a few tips. And again, this presentation was put together from things that we learned and from things that we learned from Woody. One of the first things that's important is to think about ergonomics. Think about the room setup, make sure everyone can easily see the screen, make it comfortable and easy to switch drivers, and have a timer handy. If you're remote mobbing, make sure each person's computer has all the tools they need set up before you start. The medium, one of the things that we learned in our dojo was that the medium doesn't matter. Originally, we started out mobbing around a computer, but we found out that mobbing works just as well at a whiteboard or across a collaboration screen, like, for instance, a Cisco board or Microsoft Hub. And the results come out the same. You get the same level of collaboration and same level of understanding. You can even use Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel, or a drawing program for mobbing. In some cases, it helps to have pleasing music. And there's two areas where this can be helpful. If it's not too distracting to just have some soft background music going, a lot of times that'll help members to stay relaxed and to stay focused on the work at hand. But also, we're used to a timer being a beeping noise or a chiming noise or a buzzing noise. But most cell phone timers have the ability to be configured so that the sound that goes when the timer goes off is a song rather than a buzzing or a beeping noise. So if there's a song that the team members can agree on, that's a good thing to use to indicate when it's time to change drivers. Having a research computer is another useful thing. Ideally, we want people's computers and cell phones turned off when they're in the mobbing session, although with remote mobbing, that's not really possible. But having someone or a particular computer designated to do research takes that off of the driver so that the driver can stay focused on the task at hand. Right-sized teams. We've found that this is an important aspect of good mobbing. Keeping the teams to about 5 to 7 people seems to work the best. We've also found that having a good working agreement is good. I always start with the working agreement. Whenever a new team is forming, very first thing I do, preferably in one of the first meetings that we have, is to create a working agreement. And then that working agreement should be reviewed and revised regularly to make sure that we still agree that that's how we want to continue working. And have a plan. At the start of every mobbing session, establish a clear, specific goal for that session. Why would we want to work this way? Well, first of all, there's knowledge sharing. One of the things that I've heard for 40 years, and it's never really worked, is the idea of knowledge transfer. For ideas to go from one person's brain into another, there's always a certain loss of fidelity. But if we're all working on the same problem together, then we tend to have a common experience about how to solve that problem, and we tend to have similar knowledge about it. So there isn't any actual knowledge transfer that needs to take place. We get continuous code and design reviews. So we're constantly looking at the code. We're constantly looking at how we're designing the solution to the problem. And we're getting input from all of the different squad members on how the problem should be solved. We get many different perspectives. We get diversity of thought by having people work together instead of each working on their own stuff. It helps us to stay focused on working on the right things. We can ask each other questions about, are we going down a rabbit hole here, or is this really what we should be working on? We get rapid feedback. We're able to try out new ideas. test them with the stakeholders, get feedback on that, revise, and move on. And we're able to provide better solutions by doing that. As I already pointed out from my discussion with Woody a couple of years ago, that we get better flow of our work items. We're working in a single piece flow, so we don't have a lot of distractions. We're not being pulled in different directions. We're able to focus on solving one problem all the way through to completion. Excuse me. As a result of this, we end up with a higher quality product, and it's also more fun, less stressful, and more engaging for team members. So how can 5 people be productive at one computer? So we can think of productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness as 3 different components of how we work. So to put some definitions on this, productivity is the output that you're getting from particular inputs. Efficiency can be thought of as doing things right, in other words, avoiding making mistakes. And effectiveness can be thought of as doing the right things. So why we're after effectiveness, I can be very productive, but I can be productive working on the wrong things. Think about email as an example. I can spend half a day going through my email, but I didn't actually deliver anything. Efficiency, I can be very efficient, but I can be working on busy work that doesn't really matter. But when I'm focused on effectiveness, I'm focused on working on the right things. So I have this quote here: transformation comes more from pursuing profound questions than seeking practical answers. So, the person I collaborated with on this PowerPoint, they said, I wanted a better question. And the better question, to get to the better question, we said, okay, let's invert. Let's look at it the other way around. What is a possible inversion to the question, how can we be effective with 5 people working at one computer? And a way of looking at that is to say, how can we be effective if we separate the people who should be working together? And this led to an even better question: what are the things that destroy effectiveness? So if we look at that, some possible categories of things that destroy effectiveness: communication problems, decision-making problems, technical debt, politics, meetings. These are all things that can make us less effective at doing our work. We noticed many of the problems faded away when we started doing mobbing. Communication problems aren't a thing because we're in the same room or we're on the same Microsoft Teams call. Decision-making problems, usually we try to have the right decision makers on the call, and if we don't, we pull them in as we need them. Technical debt, I can't say that we don't have technical debt, because we do, but we're able to have the conversation and decide, is this technical debt that we're willing to take on as a team, or is this technical debt that we can comfortably defer? Politics, one of the things that we try to do is to be on an equal level playing field. I go in as the squad lead, but I'm more of a facilitator and a participant than someone who's in a position of authority over the other team members. So we try to eliminate that politics as much as possible. It tends to be a more egalitarian type of situation. And what we've done about meetings is to just incorporate. In fact, I had a meeting just before I came on this Zoom. What we try to do about meetings is to just incorporate them into the flow of the day. So we needed to discuss with another squad how we're going to present a presentation in a lunch and learn next week. And so we just pulled the 2 squads together in our mobbing room, talked about what we needed to do in the presentation, and then went our separate ways. So 20 minutes of our mobbing time, we took up talking about how we're going to present the lunch and learn next week. So much more efficient and much more effective than if we had had a separate meeting that people had to attend and make time for.
Loren, can I please ask a question about the previous slide?
Yes, absolutely.
From what I can tell, the main advantages of more programming, from what I see, is improved communication, like the communication of problem, the decision making, and technical debt. So a lot of it is involving around communication between team members. This is what I understand.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Thank you for pointing that out. The other thing that's an advantage of working this way is that we're able to work in an agile fashion, but eliminate most of the agile ceremonies. What I mean by that is, you know, if you've worked on Scrum teams or on Kanban teams, you know, usually there's about anywhere from 2 hours to 4 hours a week of time that the team members have to give up as productive work time, because they're in grooming sessions, they're in playbacks, they're in retrospectives, there are various different ceremonies that are chewing up a lot of the team's work time. When we're working in a mob programming environment, we don't have to have most of those ceremonies. We do still have every other week, the squad that I lead has a retrospective for 45 minutes. And every week we have a grooming session for 45 minutes. But other than those two ceremonies, all of our other ceremonies happen in the mobbing session. So we're not taking separate time to do agile ceremonies and wasting time on things that don't contribute value to the product. So most of our hours are spent actually contributing value to the product.
Okay, sounds amazing. Thank you.
Yep. And then came the pandemic. I think you can all probably relate to this. We found ourselves working remotely. Fortunately, many of the things that we'd learned mobbing together, each on our own computers, translated nicely into remote working. So one of the things that happened as we started mobbing, we had one of our colleagues, most of us are on Windows computers. One of our colleagues was on a Mac. And we were trying to mob using a driver computer and a research computer. And our friend who was on the Mac would switch to the driver computer and be just so confused by the keyboard layout. The trackpad worked the opposite way. So he'd swipe up and the screen would go down, and he'd swipe down and the screen would go up. And it was just causing too many problems for him and for the rest of us. So what we decided to do was make sure that we each had the same, not necessarily the exact same tools, but the same functionality of tools on our individual computers. So we each had an editor that provided us with a robust set of editing capabilities and language capabilities. We each had the Git command line tools on our computer, and various other tools that we felt were essential for us to be able to do our work. And that way, we could go into a room together and open a Teams meeting and share with the screen presented up on the big screen so that everybody could see it, but each person working on their individual computer. And this was before the pandemic even started. So when the pandemic came, it was just sort of a natural transition from the way we had been working to it being remote. And instead of us all being in a room together, each on our own laptops, we were now each in our own home office on our own laptops. And so many of the things that we learned from mobbing together just translated nicely into remote working. We found that screen sharing and using Web IDE, so what I mean by the Web IDE is in GitLab, there's a Web IDE feature that allowed us to edit and make small changes. For larger changes, we found that Visual Studio Code works really well. And of course, Visual Studio Code is available across all different platforms. So we were able to use that as our editing tool, regardless of whether somebody was on a Mac or a Windows machine or potentially a Linux machine. And we all had the same editing experience. For a while, we were using a kitchen timer. At this point, I use the timer on my cell phone. It works just fine. We also found that there's a timer in Visual Studio Code that you can use. And so that, we've tried that with some success. Most of us were able to adapt to working productively remote. But for some people, they found it difficult to stay focused and present when we were remote. And so there were some key takeaways that we learned from remote mobbing that were a little different from working in person. So, you know, we already talked about each person on their own computer. Minimizing distractions is really important. You know, we have cell phones and other devices in our home offices. It's important to, you know, minimize the distractions from those kinds of things. We found that it was important to be disciplined in the use of the timer, especially when new teams were forming. As we get some experience working together, we can be a little more flexible about changing drivers. But in the beginning, when we're first getting to know each other and getting established in our ways of working together, it's important to change drivers on a regular cadence and you know, make sure that we're honoring the timer. Another thing we learned is that it's not a good idea to require everyone to drive. In some cases, there are people who feel too intimidated, you know, to share their screens and have other people seeing what they're typing. We try to work through that though. But if there's somebody who has significantly more knowledge and experience on a particular topic than others, we ask them to drive last or not to drive. And you may be wondering, why would we want them not to drive? We want to avoid, remember at the beginning, I said, this is not 5 people watching one person code. And we want to avoid getting into that situation. So when somebody has significantly more knowledge about the subject area than the rest of the people, we try to encourage them to either drive last or not drive, because that puts the less experienced people on the keyboard and gives them a chance to learn. And it's important to be sure to take regular breaks. You know, you don't tend to think about it when people are working in their own space, but we still need time to disengage, time to recharge, time to just get away from the computer for a few minutes, maybe get a cup of coffee. So what we've tended to do in the squad that I lead is we just take advantage of BRB, right? We'll type in the chat, BRB, get up, go take a break, get a cup of coffee, do whatever we need to, and come back. I just got a notice that my internet is unstable. Are you guys still able to hear me clearly?
Yes, yeah. I can hear you. Okay,
very good. Let's see.
Loren?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Just quick question about the timer. Do you mind to elaborate more, please, about the timer use? Like, what exactly do you guys do with the timer?
So the use of the timer is to make sure that we change drivers at regular intervals. When we started out, we were using, and in the training classes, we were using a 10-minute interval on the timer. As we've gotten more maturity, we've discovered that 15 or 20 minutes is generally a better interval to use, and sometimes as much as 30 minutes. What the timer does is it says, okay, when the timer goes off, whoever's driving commits the work that they're doing and pushes that up to GitLab, and then the next driver takes over. And usually we do that in a round robin. So, you know, if we've got 5 people, let's say, we'd start with the first one, we'd go to the next one. When we get around to the last one, we'd come back to the first one. And the importance of switching drivers like that is, you know, remember, we're trying to make sure that we're sharing the knowledge and that we're sharing the experience so that everybody comes away with the same understanding of the product that we're producing. You know, this isn't you know, one person coding and other people watching. This is a collaborative effort to produce a product. So one of the ways to avoid getting into that rut of one person coding while others are watching is to make sure that we're changing drivers on a regular cadence. Like I say, as we've gotten more experience working together, we've found that the times when we change drivers are at the, what's the right way of putting this, the logical commit points, let's say, the points where it makes sense to commit code and go on, you know, pivot on to the next thing. So sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's 30 minutes. But initially, when you're first getting started, it's important to honor the timer and change drivers when the timer goes off. Does that answer your question?
Answered perfectly, yes, thank you.
Okay. And then the other thing that we learned in remote mobbing is that it's really important to have a specific goal and to set the expectation on that goal and to stay very focused. When we're remote, as opposed to all being in the same room, you know, people can turn off their cameras, they can be doing other things in the background and getting distracted and maybe not even contributing, maybe just sitting there listening and not even making a contribution. So in remote mobbing, it's much more important to have a clear objective and for everyone to stay focused. And, you know, sometimes when we're first getting started, I'll even ask people to leave their cameras on for a while. And then the last thing is to make sure that we have at least some kind of a retrospective of what we've just worked on at the end of each session. That helps us to know whether or not we've met our objective. And then what I'd like to share with you next are some helpful links. This first one is a YouTube video from a go-to session that was held back in, I think, 2017 or 2018. This is the master himself, Woody Zuhl, presenting about mob programming, and I'd highly recommend that each of you go and watch that video. You'll get a lot out of it. And he talks about some things that I didn't talk about because he's been doing this a lot longer and has a much deeper understanding. This is another link to some resources on mob programming. And then finally, this is a link, the last link here is a link to Woody's book on mob programming. And what I'll do is I'll take these links and I'll drop them into the chat of the Zoom so that you guys can share those. So at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to open it for any questions that anyone has. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask me. I'm happy to answer any question.
Okay, I have a question about as you said, making sure that everyone will use the same tools. But as we know, every developer has its own preferences. And how do you deal with something that, you know, it's hard to change, like the behavior or to, because as I can see, it's something very important in the mob programming.
So it's not so much necessary for each person to use the exact same tools. What's most important is the exact same functionality of the tool. So what I mean by that is we need a text editor that has the same capabilities. We chose to standardize on Visual Studio Code because Visual Studio Code has a lot of common features that developers like and that are easy for people to use. And it's got wide user base. There are other tools that are just as effective. And so, you know, in the squad that I lead, I don't dictate to people that they should use Visual Studio Code. If they're more comfortable with Atom or with IntelliJ or some other editor, that's fine, as long as the basic functionality that we need is there. Now, as far as things like Git and GitLab, those standards were set for us by the company. So, you know, we use that because that's the tool that the company has adopted. But, you know, in terms of tooling that people use locally, it's more about the functionality that the tool provides than the specifics of the tool. An exception to that would be what Maven or Gradle version we're using, because that does need to be, sorry about that. My Alexa thinks I was talking to her. Hold on.
Check your Wi-Fi connection to settings.
Sorry about that. Any other questions?
Well, actually, I have a bunch of questions. Hi, Loren. Let me just start with I'm trying to understand what's the ideal context of mob programming, because like I can't really understand it as a standalone technique. It should be inside some kind of framework or some kind of experiment with a special client or something, what is the ideal context? Where can I experiment mob programming without doing any harm?
Okay. So where I chose to experiment with it, for us to get started, was to just take something that wasn't working. In our case, it was the lab exercise of one of our classes that we were teaching in the dojo, and apply mob programming to that and just see what the results were. We're no longer experimenting. At this point, we're using mob programming on a day-to-day basis, and it's how we do our work. But it took a while to get there. We had to have some successes first. Where we got that initial success was with a project that we worked on. There's a tool from Booz Allen Hamilton called Jenkins Templating Engine, and we wanted to implement that for use at Delta. And we decided, okay, well, let's try pulling inner source contributors into mobbing sessions and mob on that and see how that works out. And what we found was that it worked out quite well. We were getting a lot of diversity of contribution. We were having contributors from all different areas of the company that would come and join us for a few hours at a time and contribute their ideas. We'd incorporate that into the code of what we were creating. And the next day we might be working with a completely different group of people. Since we've started our cloud transformation, we found that this is an excellent way of taking people, some of whom have strong knowledge in a particular area and some of whom have no knowledge whatsoever in a particular area, and bringing them up to a common level of understanding. And so at this point, like I said, it's how we work on a day-to-day basis. Our day starts with a daily stand-up, and then from 9:30 to 11:30 every morning, we're in a mobbing session. In the afternoons, we have an optional mobbing session, and then we have focus time in the late afternoon. And that's just how we structure our day. Now, this is very different from how Woody Zuhl has implemented mobbing in the organizations that he's used it in. They mob from the start of the workday to the end of the workday, and they take a break in the middle for lunch. Sometimes they go to lunch together, sometimes they go to lunch separately. Some squad members go out for walks together during lunch, others go to their desks and eat their lunch. One of the nice things about it is that it can be adapted to the needs of a particular squad. It doesn't have to be, there are no hard and fast rules about how mobbing works. There are some good suggestions about how mobbing works, but really no hard and fast rules. This is also one of the reasons that I always start each mobbing, each new squad, I always start with a working agreement, because that's really sort of the foundation that helps us to understand how we're working together and why we're working together in this way. You asked what time it was, and I told you the history of Big Dan, but did that answer your question?
Yes, it did, but it made me think about more follow-up questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Can I? Okay, so it fits, as you say, about to every production environment. You can write code about almost everything with mob programming. I'm still curious about the context. So I can see how it fits with XP. I can see how it fits with Kanban. I don't really see how it fits with Scrum. I guess it's some kind of mixture of everything, and you just choose how to build your environment and your framework, agile framework, which is great. What I'm trying to understand now is about the team. Can it be cross-functional? Is it like a Kanban, then you with other developers just take a task and just do it in the two mobbing sessions? What's the size of the task? What's the velocity? Do you count the velocity in a week, in a stream, in a sprint? How does it work daily?
So on the squad that I'm leading right now, we opted to do Kanban. There's no reason we couldn't have done Scrum, but it was just a preference to do Kanban. Right now, we're at a velocity of approximately 10 stories a week. The stories are scoped to between half a day and 2 days. Ideally, for mob programming, stories that are scoped to a day or less work best because we're able to pull something in the morning, make sure we have a clear understanding of that story, work the story to completion, and by the end of the day, we're moving that story into ready for test or into done. So, you know, that was also one of the decisions why we felt like Kanban worked better for us than Scrum. But there's no reason you couldn't use either of those methods with mob programming. As far as, let's see, I talked already about the size of the stories. Refresh my memory. What were some of your other questions there?
A cross-functional.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that one up. That's important. We don't specialize. Some mobbing teams do specialize, but we don't specialize. Everybody in our squads is expected to work on all aspects of the product that we're producing. I know I saw your eyebrows go up, and I know that
I'm thinking about content and about design. So
understood. And the way that we're working wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for a squad that's producing, let's say, a website where you've got content designers and UX designers and back-end developers trying to work on something. But there's no reason that all of those people can't be in the room working on the product together. So even if we weren't generalists on my squad, we would still want to have all of those different disciplines in the room because each of them contributes to the final product. So, you know, we don't want to have the UX designer go off and work independently and then come back and they've created something that doesn't work with the back end design, right? We want everybody working together on the product.
So basically you're building end-to-end stories.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And so the way that we're typically structuring our stories is from the consumer's perspective. The tools that we're building right now are tools for other developers to use to build software. So we start with the developer experience. If the developer is looking, for instance, to create a Java Quarkus application that reads from a Kafka queue, how do we create a pattern for that the developer can just go pull that GitLab repo off the shelf, have everything in there that they need, you know, to have a starter template for the application, a starter template for the queue, the pipelines to build their application. Where we want to be able to have that developer start is from a complete working application that they can then go and modify to suit their needs. So we want it to have a pipeline, we want it to have the monitoring in place, the alerting in place, dashboards for observability. We want to be able to put all of that into the packet, right? So that what they're pulling when they pull that repository is going to be a place that they can get started to build a finished application. And so because of the way that we're looking at the work that we're doing, we always start with that developer as the persona that we're trying to build the application for. You know, and really good agile design always works that way, right? We always start with who's going to be consuming our application and what is it that they want? You know, why did they pick up their cell phone and open my app? You know, what is it that they're trying to achieve by clicking on that icon? And that's always where we should start. So our stories are organized around what is it that the developer is going to want to be able to do as a result of this story. Do we have any other questions?
No, it doesn't seem so. it was really interesting hearing the conversation between you two, because Amit did not tell you, but he is a CTO, and it's something that was enjoyable to hear about how to approach from a new system. So it's thank you for that.
Now that I know that, Amit, one of the things that I would highly recommend that you do is get a copy of Woody Zuhl's book. I just posted the links in the chat. Get a copy of his book. There's a chapter in there that he wrote to people in exactly your role, that he wrote with the intention of saying, you know, why would I want to take the risk? You know, I'm a CTO of a big company, and you know, it's going to be risky to change the way that people work. Why would I want to take this risk? And what are the costs versus the benefits of people working this way? And he gives a pretty honest analysis. Go ahead.
Yeah, you already replied. You talked about effectiveness.
Right. Yeah. But he goes into a lot more detail, you know, and for some types of projects and for some types of work, it may be a coin toss. You know, for other applications and for other types of work, you may say, you know what, my support costs are 15% of what they would have been if I'd been working the other way. So even though it's costing me more on the development side, I'd rather save the money on the support side. So, you know, but I would highly recommend that you read the book, and that especially focus on that chapter, because he talks in detail and he's talking directly to you in that chapter.
Thank you. No, it's always the search to the perfect balance between cost, quality, and velocity.
Right. Yep. Well, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I do have another meeting that I'm being asked to join, so I am going to have to leave, but I do appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you guys this evening. Thank you for having me.
Loren, thank you very much for your time. We know it's also the holiday season, and again, it's something that we are very excited about. And now that we know this new approach, we can share it with a couple of more of our members and the Israeli community. So thank you again, and we're happy to see you again in the future.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye.